Originally, this canvas was going to be a second in the series of my Flintstones paintings, but due to the amount of grief I got from the first painting, I opted to never paint the second one. Here I'm just using a plastic card to scrape on paint. It gives a lot of texture, which I like. Here we have a rough layout, just done in a Sablo pencil so that it's water-based and can just be removed. Here, as you see, my battery died, so I don't have any video of my scraping in these colors using the same card technique. Again, I'm doing some detail work on these steps using a Molotow paint pen, which is kind of an acrylic, but it really never seems to wind up being waterproof or water resistant when they dry, which is good and bad. It can be very handy if you need to change something, but it can be a real pain if you need to work over it. This part gets pretty boring as it's kind of slow, so I'm going to clip the video here and speed it up, and we'll see some more of this progression. So at this point, I'm putting in some details, and I like smudging paint with my fingers a lot. I'll dip it in water sometimes to really smudge it around, or just kind of smudge it with my fingers in order to get some grimy look to things. And that kind of fits Pillow and Lucky's world a lot, as anyone that follows the cartoon strip knows that their world is pretty grimy, just generally not an overwhelmingly pleasant place. Here I'm adding in some darker brick colors in order to help create the illusion of bricks instead of just the scraped in background paint. And this is a bit of a process. It takes a while to get done, and then afterwards I will use a paint pen again and probably outline a lot of that to some degree or another in order to get even more of a brick texture. We're going to jump ahead again in just a second, and we'll take a look at how we do all that, I hope. So here I'm adding in some lights on what will become the marquee of this club or theater or whatever it's actually going to be. I'm not quite sure at this point. I kind of do these things as I go sometimes. I'll add in things, take things out. Yeah, it's just, I don't know. The background to me is kind of a thing that kind of develops as it goes. I know what I want to get out of it, but I just never know how to get there sometimes. And so it just kind of happens organically sometimes. As you can see, I'm putting in a lot of highlighting to create separation from one building to the next. You probably saw earlier in the speeded up area where I was putting in more dark smudges to create more shadow in certain areas to also help create this separation. You'll probably notice also the marquee, I didn't finish putting in all the lights, and I tend to jump around like that. I'll start on one thing and then be like, oh, I gotta stop for that for a minute and do something else before I forget. And yeah, it's a lot of back and forth. I'm kind of a strange painter like that. I just never know what I'm gonna do next, especially with backgrounds. It's just usually when I'm doing the cartoons, the actual drawings on paper, I actually do the foreground first and the background afterwards. But with a painting, it's kind of awkward to do that for me anyways. So I tend to do the background first and then figure out how to get the characters in there, which is probably not the best plan, but I did have a layout, so I kind of knew where everything went. I also have a rough sketch on paper that tells me where everything goes as well. I'm using Alpha 6 paint pens here, and I'm also painting most of the background with Alpha 6 Corporation's paints, which are an acrylic-based paint, which I like a lot. I've really come to enjoy them a lot. They have a nice body to them, plenty of good dense color, and you can thin them out with a little bit of their reducer or even water, and you can do a lot with them. They're like any artist acrylic, except for they just seem a little bit better in some ways, and they come in bottles instead of tubes, and I don't know, they're just a really likable paint. You can do a lot with them, and they've come out with these paint pens that I wish they had more of them, and I wish you could buy them individually instead of in packs, but it is what it is. So as you can see here, I'm putting in a lot more signage. There's always a lot of signage in the backgrounds of when Pillow and Lucky are outdoors, because I grew up in an area where in the 60s there were marquees and signs and billboards and posters and just everything everywhere all over. The downtown area was really, there was a certain area of it that was referred to as the combat zone, which was just loaded with strip clubs and bars and just really seedy places. And then 30 feet away on the other side of the street would be Filene's Basement department store and, other well-known department stores, So it was like family outing on one side of the street and not so much family outing on the other side of the street. It was a pretty crazy place, and especially at night, it got really pretty bizarre. And that's kind of where the whole world of Pillow and Lucky came about. And I've lived in other places like that throughout the U.S. and spent a lot of time in clubs and whatnot, and that's how they came into their creation is through a lifetime of nightclubs and strippers and bikers and outcast type people that were, I guess, what you would call society's throwaways. That's the only way I can express it, because that's how I felt many times. So right now this is getting kind of dull again. I don't know why I painted the sign white and then decided to paint it red, and that made no real sense to me. I kind of going back and forth with these things again. I mean, I didn't paint it all that way, but it was just, I don't know. I do weird things when I paint. I could change my mind at any second and change half of the painting before you could even blink. All right, so we're going to skip ahead again a little bit in just a second here. So you'll see throughout this section, again, I'm adding some highlights along edges and just trying to get more of that brick feel going, adding in a lot of details. You'll see a lot of that as we go through this section. Lots of extra detailing, more details, putting in windows, putting in window ledges, all sorts of crazy stuff. And as far as the colors of it go, I go back and forth, and I'll put in white and then I'll put in black again and put in white again, and it never comes out the way I want it to the first time, and I have to kind of futz with everything and fight with it. And this painting here is probably the first actual painting that I've done in quite some time, really. I can't even remember the last real painting I did. I've done a lot of cartooning and illustration and sketch cards and stuff like that, but I honestly can't remember the last real painting I did at the moment. So anyways, so here we are, and we're doing a whole bunch of details. As you can see, I'm using both Molotow paint pens and the Alpha 6 paint pens, going back and forth. I really like the Alpha 6 paint pens because of the paint. It dries nice, and it's got a nice water resistance to it. I just wish they would make some of their pens with a much finer tip than what they have. They have the great big 4mm tips, which are great for filling in decent sized spaces, but they're not much good for doing detail work. So by the time I'm done with this painting, it's going to have some sort of top coat on it, because again, the Molotow paint pens are not what I would call overwhelmingly waterproof. They really can get damaged pretty easily by moisture if you're not careful with them. A little less so on paper than on canvas, because the paper absorbs the paint, but it can still happen. So this will wind up with a top coat eventually, for sure. All right, we're going to jump ahead again a little bit. So you've probably noticed by now that when I'm doing signage in this world, I don't worry about being overly neat about it, because there's just no point. It's just background, and it's really not the end all and be all. I'm not trying to create super high end fine art on this particular instance. And by the time I'm done throwing a bunch of highlighting and lights on it, it'll be hard to read most of it anyways. And again, this whole world is supposed to have a grunge kind of feel and look to it. Half the time, I don't even know what I'm going to write. The signage sometimes will say one thing and then it'll get changed as I actually paint it to something else. So that's kind of another little odd thing about my paintings. You know, sometimes I'll be doing a sketch and say, oh, I'm going to have this sign say that, and then I go to paint it and it says something completely different. I just never know what the heck I'm doing with it. I just kind of, I don't know. The backgrounds are just nothing to me. It's just like a bunch of noise, and that's the way I remember it. In the combat zone in downtown Boston, it was just all the signage everywhere, especially at night. It just became a bunch of noise. You couldn't hardly tell one thing from the other. So there's that. Okay, so this is where the fun starts. We're going to break out the airbrush and we're going to start adding glow to all the lighting. All the light bulbs will now be lit up, which really gives a kind of cool effect. I'll be doing the same thing to the lettering, probably multiple times in order to get the effects that I really want, because I haven't done any real airbrushing in a very long time, so I'm kind of rusty at that. But for this particular piece, I'm really not trying to be hyper accurate like I used to be when I was painting t-shirts for 10 or 15 years. Here I'm just like blasting some white in, and then eventually I'll probably go back in with some more red and possibly white yet again in order to create this crazy neon effect. When I start working on the marquee here in a second, you'll see that I've overlapped the lettering and colors multiple times in order to get this strange effect. Now I'm spraying red over all the white to give it sort of a pink glow, because a lot of strip clubs and places like that, they love that red neon signage inside the clubs. There's frequently red lighting. That's to help hide certain skin problems. You know, if girls have certain shifts in their skin tone and whatnot, you won't see it because of the red lights. It makes the skin all real nice looking unless you're up close and personal. And that's just one of the trade secrets of strip clubs is a lot of red lighting. So that's the effect I'm trying to shoot for here by adding all this. Now, I can't really call this fine art, but that's kind of what I'm hoping to create with a new direction. Oh, here we're putting on a bunch of the top coat I was talking about earlier. The reason I don't call it fine art is because it's still a cartoon style, and it still has the storyline up in the corner or wherever it winds up. But it's a painting, so it's kind of pushing cartooning in the direction of fine art, if you will. Maybe not fine art like Michelangelo, but given some of the stuff that I've seen in galleries, I would say this is as good, if not better, than some things that I've seen. So, but that's a different story for another time. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you liked the painting. I had a lot of fun doing it. It was a trial getting it all on video, that's for sure. I kept having camera problems. But yeah, I think it turned out pretty good. Now, what I'm going to actually do with it, I don't know. I know I'm not going to sell it for a while. I'm hoping that maybe I'll make some prints from it, or hopefully if I get to do some more paintings soon, I can maybe present them to one of the galleries that does more crazy kind of artwork stuff and see if maybe I can get Pillow and Lucky into art gallery. Wouldn't that be a real strange trip, you know? I mean, that'd put this whole thing into a whole different world if I could get these two into an art gallery somewhere. All right. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have questions or anything, by all means, hit me in the comments and I'll be happy to say whatever I can say about whatever questions you got. All right, later. Bye.